Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to Training Your Memory Lab staff. This is our June webinar, the 6th webinar in a series of 8 intended to help build and strengthen a network of memory labs in California. Many thanks to the State Library and Suzanne for coming from LAPL. This is really wonderful to have you here. We're hoping that this will kind of build and support memory labs that are starting to pop up. We have a bunch already, but they're starting to pop up thanks to the State Library's CopyCat grant program. The links to register, actually next slide, please, Suzanne. The links to register are available here at californiarevealed.org/memorylabs. We have a couple more coming up. In July, evaluating your lab, and then our last webinar together will be about sustaining and expanding. And next month we have our special guest, gosh, I'm forgetting her name. We have a special guest from the State Library who will help talk about kind of IMLS evaluation guidelines, and then just evaluating your own lab as we go along. And then in August, we have from Tehama County, our guests, Eddie Proctor and Todd Deck are coming, who have established their memory lab, I think around the same time. Were they part of your cohort, Suzanne? Maybe they were.
No, they must be from a second.
Okay, yeah, so they've been around, I guess, a year now. So they'll be talking about sustaining and expanding where they are and their goals. So I do encourage you all to come. And this webinar series is really kind of, because we're all virtual these days, this is kind of a supplement for an in-person boot camp, which we hope to do next year to keep supporting the memory labs. And all of this training is based on the Memory Lab Network's deep dive, which is available here at memorylabnetwork.github.io. There's just so many resources, so I always want to give a shout out to that link and thank Siobhan Hagen for putting those resources together, and she's been a wonderful resource throughout this webinar training. So do encourage you all to just keep diving deep into these different topics. Okay, next slide, please. Thank you. So we are getting together casually every Tuesday, the last Tuesday of each month at noon. And we have a few more coming up. So far, we've met a couple times. All are welcome to talk about where you are in your planning. We're happy to expand upon any topics that we've talked about so far. And if there's anything you'd like us to focus on with the upcoming webinars, this is the time to get together and talk about it. So here's a link to register. I can put it in the chat too, for you all to come, and then we can kind of have more time for conversation, because I know this is more like presentation heavy. So it would be nice to get to know each other a little bit more and talk about your plans. Okay, so yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne, for coming. Suzanne is our special guest senior librarian for the Digitization and Special Collections Department at Los Angeles Public Library, and she's one of LAPL's Memory Lab ambassadors. Her job is to ensure that staff, training, resources, and processes are in place to provide efficient and effective cataloging and metadata services for special collections material, as well as prioritizing items for digitization. So welcome, Suzanne. Thank you so much for coming, and I'll let you take it from here.
Thank you, Pamela, and for inviting me to speak today. I do want to stress to start with that I did not have a background in AV archiving before we started the Memory Lab programs at our library. So it's really something that anyone who has a willingness and a passion to learn about technology and to teach others how to use it can accomplish. So I wanted to start off by kind of a little introduction to the memory labs at LAPL for those who might not have been familiar with it before. We have on the left is where our DIY memory lab lives, which is in the makerspace known as Octavia Lab at Central Library. This memory lab was funded by the IMLS grant that came through DC Public Library and was supported, by them, is really modeled after the DC Public Library Memory Lab. And we have a handful of different formats that are available for staff to transfer from, including, scanning documents, photographs, and negatives, VHS, audio cassette. We have, because we're in LA, we anticipated that patrons would want a lot more various formats since we're home to the largest entertainment industry in the world. So we additionally have mini disc. We have a DAT tape player. We have a U-matic deck, and also DV cam, among a few others that are also, they're all listed on our website. And then on the right, we have the mobile memory lab, which Pamela informed me that some of you want to have a mobile version of your lab as well. So this one was funded by an internal grant through the Los Angeles Library Foundation called IDEAS. And this enabled us to bring equipment out to branches and to community organizations to hold scanning days, collecting photographs, documents, and other materials, as well as oral histories. Much of what I'm going to focus on today is on the DIY portion of it, but I'll touch on mobile a little bit as well. So as far as the LAPL's memory lab training and staffing evolution, I started out recruiting and training about 24 LAPL staff, including those inside my department, which is Digitization and Special Collections, along with staff in other subject departments at Central Library. And I created a schedule for them and allowed them to sign up for shifts on Google Calendar when they were available. And this was a little bit what I learned from this. Like at the time, I was not a supervisor, so it's a little bit tricky, getting consistent attendance for shifts. So I thought I would supplement with volunteers recruited amongst library users. So I worked with our volunteer engagement division or department to recruit from volunteermatch.com. And there were also patrons who were interested in volunteering through participating in memory lab orientations. In this case, we had some really great volunteers who could come pretty regularly, but for the most part, because we were located in downtown LA and parking and traffic can be difficult, most volunteers kind of, didn't stay for too long of a time. I do recommend, if you are based at a branch or somewhere where volunteers would be more readily be able to access, maybe they live in the neighborhood, they would, setting a time commitment for them would be more effective than in my case, which due to location. But finally, by late 2019, early 2020, our department was able to assign permanent staff to the DIY Memory Lab via training Octavia Lab staff, so staff that was already built into the space where our Memory Lab lives, and assigning one of the digitization and special collection clerks to be available twice a week, like on the same 2 days, twice a week, so that if patrons want to have hands-on assistant, they can book on those specific days. With the rest of the time, all of the digitization and special collections librarians are on call for assistance if need be. And this is the structure that we're hoping to continue due to COVID-19. Of course, this past year, the lab's been closed, but we hope to continue this staffing format once the library okays long-term appointments. So documentation has been really key in training staff and volunteers, as well as patrons. So I'm going to see if I can exit full screen here for a moment. But the manual for staff and volunteers that I'm going to just show briefly here was one that I built upon from 2 other Memory Lab network cohort members. So those would be Blake Hatton from Pueblo County Library in Colorado and Aaron Purdy from Broward Library in Florida. Their handbook was a lifesaver and really helped me to get this documentation going. I'm just going to go briefly over the table of contents of the manual. So I'd include an introduction to the DIY Memory Lab. The Octavia Lab suggested that I provide a list of formats that are not currently supported by our lab as a reference. So that is included as well. The DIY Memory Lab policies are in here, appointment policies and procedures, as well as VHS, hardware setup for the different formats from VHS to CD, DVD. And also included software setup for the Blackmagic software, and some instructions for how to inspect patrons' materials before they use the lab, because we don't want patrons inserting damaged or moldy material into the equipment and potentially damaging or the equipment or other people's materials. And then there's a troubleshooting section and a section on formatting hard drives and cleaning and maintaining the Memory Lab equipment. So kind of a overall reference for staff. And what I have, like after I've done the training with staff, I encourage staff to actually read through sections that they may not be as familiar with when they're on their shifts to reinforce the different policies or workflows. And then we have internal and external websites. So for internal, I created a Google site, which if you have access to a Google account, anyone who has access to a Google account can build one and make it publicly accessible. And it's really user-friendly to create. So I have all of the information here about both Memory Lab programs, the DIY and the mobile, and explaining to people that it's not only a place with equipment for people to reformat, but also it consists of online resources with information for users on how to care for their personal archives. And it's an educational series of classes and programs as well. I link out to our calendar events with all of the workshops that are upcoming related to Memory Lab, as well as providing resources for branch librarians or who may want to put on this program, these programs. There are flyer shells for people to create promotional materials for workshops, all of the slides and transcripts and handouts for the DIY Memory Lab orientation and additional workshops are here. For the DIY Memory Lab orientation, we actually require patrons to take the orientation before they can book an appointment. So that's why we have a sign-in sheet for that as proof of attendance. We'll actually, I'll talk a little bit more about this later, but we're actually going to be, because of the pandemic, moving towards a virtual Memory Lab orientation. These are all workshops that we have put on since the beginning of the grant. We actually started offering workshops first before the equipment became available, because the funding took some time to come through. So that was, those were actually really popular. Interestingly enough, really popular in the beginning when we didn't have the equipment, because people thought the workshops were the orientation to use the equipment. And we found actually after the equipment was made available, attendance dropped quite a bit. But there is like still interest in these in the content of these workshops for sure. There was the Think Like an Archivist, How to Care for Analog Family Keepsakes. Get Your Scan On, which is a basic intro to digitization, how to use a scanner. Digital Preservation Basics Photos is based on this great workshop that Siobhan put on, and Planning Your Digital Estate, which was one that was put together by Jamie Mears, who was the resident at DC Public Library at the beginning of their Memory Lab creation. We also included this, we invited a speaker who was part of Afro Crowd to put on training on local history, on how to run a local history Wikipedia edit-a-thon. All of the slides and tutorial information is here as well. Evaluation information, our evaluation form, we have a print and online form available here, and contact information for librarians to let us know when they put on these programs. And then resources that could be helpful for instructors who are putting on these classes are listed down at the end. And then the public facing site is lapl.org/memorylab. We have all of the workflows for the DIY Memory Lab here for staff and patrons to reference as they're going through the process of reformatting. You can find all of our workflows here, and feel free to pull from them and build upon them for your own pages if you would like. And back to the presentation. So some training considerations as you're starting. I found the biggest challenge to be resistance to change and fear of unfamiliar technologies. But even like someone who's maybe older and not as familiar with technology, I found will, after repeated use, will we'll see that it's not so intimidating, you know, with practice. Like initially, it might seem like a lot, it might seem overwhelming, but all it takes is time and practice to become familiar with how the process works. And for recruitment, you'll want to, if you don't have permanent staff, you'll want to recruit at regular intervals and set a minimum commitment period. And emphasize to people that expertise is not required. We're always learning from each other. I'm like, you know, a couple years in, still learning about different aspects of the memory lab and its equipment. So don't feel like you have to know AV or tech very well. And adaptability is a good characteristic to have. Failure is going to happen, and that's okay. Just you know, pick yourself back up and look for creative solutions and ask your network for help. You have Siobhan, you have the Memory Lab Network, you have California Revealed that you can reach out to. And so I'm going to go into some principles and recommendations of training on 3 different levels, including behind the scenes, reference, and patrons. So for as far as behind the scenes goes, that'll involve staff maintaining procedures and equipment maintenance. And the recommendation for behind the scenes staff would be to assign at least 2 ambassadors who understand the ins and outs of the memory lab in detail. That's how like the first 2 memory lab network cohorts started at each library. This works in the case if like someone goes on vacation or parental leave or leaves for a new position. You'll have one person who can train everyone else and manage lab operations. And then in turn, you'll want the ambassadors. Sorry, there's an airplane flying overhead. I'm just gonna wait a bit. So for intern ambassadors would want to train 1 to 2 staff or volunteers at a minimum. I know some of our other cohort members who have like a smaller staff or might have 1 staff assigned to the memory lab, have been able to run the lab with 1 to 2 consistent staff or consistent volunteers. So like you'll want to train them how to conduct different elements of the memory lab. The more staff you can train, the better. If you're in a larger system, like at LAPL, it was recommended we train at least 12. Adjust based on what your situation is. Again, like training other staff and volunteers is helpful in the case that like you need to assign a new ambassador, you'll have someone who's already trained. And so the Main topics that you'll want to train on would include policy and workflows, so how to assist patrons with questions, how to troubleshoot problems at the physical lab space, and this might include teaching the orientation training to users or patrons. And then the other main topic would be programming, event programming. So how to teach the memory lab orientation or preservation classes, and how to run other related events like scanning days, if that's what you want to do. And DC Public Library, they've done this wonderful working in of the memory lab into their professional development program. And I hope that I could pitch this to our library one day. So what they do is the DC Public Library, they have an annual professional development program where public-facing staff, they get to choose a training track and work on projects outside of their regular duties. So one of those tracks is digital preservation, and staff will go through training on digital preservation topics and how to teach these to the public. And that is part of their annual review, which is really, really a great idea. One of the aims is to teach the memory lab classes at as many branches as possible. If you have multiple branches, so this is their way of getting that out there. And for those who have limited time and staffing and would be relying on volunteers, another plane, sorry. Those who have limited time and staffing, you'll want to, might be a good idea to schedule one training annually or twice a year, where everyone does the training at once and can learn from each other. And then following that, maybe those staff would train a set of volunteers quarterly or biannually, kind of building off of that. Every memory lab is going to need IT support behind the scenes. So some of the things, some of the aspects that might come into play would be IT training ambassadors about guest permissions, connectivity, software and hardware that supports the memory lab stations. If possible, it would be ideal to assign like at least one IT person consistently, and it's even better if they're interested themselves in legacy formats. That is the case that happened at LAPL. We were assigned a systems analyst who was really interested in the process and has been a really great ally for us. Then I've also done this where you can try to gain additional buy-in in the IT staff by inviting those who are interested to your staff memory lab trainings, and find out if your IT staff are willing to provide memory lab help to patrons. It doesn't hurt to ask. So second level reference, this would involve staff maintaining workflow and helping patrons. So the recommendations here would be to select trainees who can learn to tackle playback, reformatting, or storage device issues. As I mentioned before, those, anyone who has an eagerness to help people learn and use technology are well suited for memory lab. And they don't have to be experts in AV, photography, or technology to learn how to run the lab. Not just myself, but a lot of other Memory Lab staff don't have this background at first in the other cohorts. You want to also, it'll be a good idea too, as an incentive to designate time for staff to transfer their personal archival materials. This will get staff invested and excited about helping people in the lab. And it also, staff will gain personal buy-in for how it feels to transfer their own memories and to protect and preserve it so they can better connect with users. So it's, oh yes, I'm seeing in the chat about the access privileges. I will be sure to make those public after the webinar. Sorry about that. Finally, final recommendation for reference staff would be to ask staff for feedback on how to make the workflows better. So you'll continually improve the workflows and you can do that iteratively with each new cohort of staff or volunteers. Those who have the hands-on practice can bring their perspective of both user and staff member in helping to make the service better. Siobhan has put together a lot of fantastic training in the DIY Memory Lab deep dive for staff who would be doing reference type work for the Memory Lab. So there's a video about Memory Lab models, including not just DC public libraries, but others as well. And then staff, so all staff would be good for them to review that recording. Staff and volunteers who are going to help patrons in the Memory Lab will want to go through the lab space workflows and troubleshooting sections in the deep dive. Those staff and volunteers who would be teaching classes and doing programming would want to watch the personal digital archiving train the trainer webinar and go through all of the introduction to event programming section from the deep dive. Then finally, we have our patrons who would be are a potential source of volunteer pool, and there be, the training for them would be for them to learn how to do, DIY these transfer processes. So recommendations for patrons would be to make workflows publicly accessible. Online and print would be great to provide a reference point for patrons as they're learning and recalling concepts. Patrons are always asking, like even, in our orientations before we mentioned the website, they're like, can we see how this process, is there somewhere where we can see how this process works before we come in for an appointment? Because they want to review it beforehand, and that helps reinforce the process for them. And then having a printout of a copy of the workflows on hand allows for quick reference, on the spot as well. Then second recommendation would be to enlist help from orientation and workshop attendees to add to your pool of volunteers with people who are already interested and invested in the Memory Lab and have already gone through training and hands-on practice. Some patrons, like they're looking for ways to serve their communities. They might have like a volunteer requirement at school that they need to fulfill, which, would help build in that timed commitment for you. Or sometimes like you'll have patrons come in who have worked professionally with legacy AV equipment. And I've had a couple who've come in who've said, yeah, feel free to reach out to me if you have any troubleshooting issues, I can try to help. So yeah, definitely your patrons can be part of that training process. And here's a list, kind of like a sampling schedule of the classes that we had offered at LAPL through Memory Lab, with some descriptions. I mentioned some of these previously, but these were the main ones that we offered on a regular basis. Our Think Like an Archivist was recorded, was offered virtually during the pandemic and recorded. So you can access and view that for your own training if you would like. And we're hoping to offer the digital preservation basics and planning your digital afterlife, hopefully later this year, virtually. And some training strategies you'll want to incorporate would, some of these you already aware of, but they're good to reinforce. So brainstorming, incorporating brainstorming in your training, soliciting ideas of what equipment, resources, or services will meet the needs of your community. How can certain aspects of workflows be improved or made more user-friendly? Process checks, so you can ask questions throughout your training to assess comprehension, or use an activity to gauge how the trainees would apply what they're learning. Role plays, so that you can see how your staff can learn how to respond to technical issues or if patrons push back on certain policies. And then, practice sessions. This I really relied heavily upon with the hands-on practice with either staff's own materials, personal materials, or I've collected sample materials for people to practice on who may not have it. And scaffolding and iteration is going to be key in your training process. At a minimum, memory labs tend to offer an orientation to review the equipment and workflows. And a lot of you might already have classes at your library around genealogy, preservation, or technology that could tie naturally in with your memory lab. We found it helpful to use the buddy system for workshops. We always have 2 staff co-teaching and to support each other. Incorporating staff who already work in a department that ties in with your memory lab would be great if possible, which we did with our Octavia lab. Inviting staff to like the public facing memory lab workshops and orientations can be worked in as part of your training as well. So so you're not offering too many sessions. Then I've also found it to be great to organize a monthly deck cleaning that doubles as a space where staff can casually discuss issues or successes that come up in appointments or classes. And what we did we did assign once a week, like it was like a 4-hour block once a week for staff to be able to make an appointment and come in and digitize their own materials in the lab. So they're invested and remain in practice. And of course, continually solicit feedback and improve upon documentation and the classes. So support for outreach, partnerships are key, both internal and external. We like for training, like for example, we worked with volunteer engagement to help recruit some of our volunteers. Handouts, whether that's digital or print, will be a great way to get the word out. So we've relied on social media, bookmarks, newsletters, flyers, zines, and more. And you might find it helpful to draft and share copies of an elevator speech for all of your memory lab staff to practice. kind of like pitching like what is the space about, why is it important, what kind of help do you need with the memory lab. And I mean, you can start with just a basic training for new volunteers. Can be, as simple as a session on scanning photos, transparencies, and documents. Some audiovisual, just simply starting with VHS and compact cassette, or having a session on like troubleshooting cabling connections and things like that. And remember, especially for those of you who are starting and don't have as many staff to begin with, keep it simple, start small, and maybe you can just train patrons first and build from there. And scaffolding and iteration is going to be really important. Use for sustainability, use existing resources, infrastructure, and programming. And that is it for my presentation. Thank you for having me. And if you have any questions, go ahead and put them in the chat.
Suzanne, thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Thank you.
Lots of amazing documentation that you put together in just a few years. It's so great to share. Thank you. A question did come in actually regarding the handbook. Nancy asked if they could utilize specific sections of the handbook to create their own.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, yes. And I will be sure to make the handbook public after we log off.
Yes, great. Thank you. Let's see, any other questions out there or comments? Don't be shy. Janae asked, can you talk a bit about the process timeline of developing the handbook? You've been doing this a couple of years, so I'm assuming it wasn't overnight.
Yes. Yeah, so like I mentioned, we took the handbook that had already been created by Aaron and Blake, and their memory labs were focused on just the scanning station, and the audiovisual station had just VHS. So from there, Kurt, who was the other ambassador at the time, and I figured out the workflows for other equipment that we were hoping to include, and also worked in our policies in collaboration with the Octavia lab that were a bit different from the other libraries. So it was an ongoing process. It was like at one point we had added maybe like 3 or 4 additional formats. And then later on we added like 3 more formats. So it's a living document. It's, I don't feel like it's ever really done. But like for it to have been ready to, I felt ready enough for it to be used for training. It took, I would say it took about a year. Yeah. Yeah, and this was all a really, like all of this was a really collaborative process. Like putting together the handbook kind of went hand in hand with putting together the web pages for the public facing website. So like I was working with the digital content team that puts up stuff on the website too, with that. So it's yeah, it was quite intensive during that time. But once you're done, like, yeah, you can, it feels really good to say, yeah, you can reference this. Um, and yeah, it's a really rewarding process.
Iterative is the key word here.
Yeah.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit if this has actually worked, where you mentioned possibly recruiting patrons to volunteer. Has that actually happened, or is that more kind of like in theory? Because I'm really curious. I mean, that seems like that could be maybe an unlimited pool if you have recurring people coming in and they obviously know the equipment. I wonder
Mhm.
if people really are willing to volunteer.
Yeah, it actually did happen. We did have patrons who were interested in helping come in. Um, it was like it was a lot of work to train. So many different people, and they came in at different times. So doing the training, like maybe like I mentioned in one of the slides. Quarterly or like biannually would help a lot more than how I did it. Um, and it was like for our location is a little difficult to get to. So I think if we were located at one of the library, like the neighborhood branches, we would have a lot more consistent volunteers, because having worked in the branches before, and worked with volunteers before in the branches, I know they came really regularly versus down at Central Library downtown.
I wonder if that would work out for the mobile, kind of the regional network that you are, the branch network that you're setting up with separately. But I wonder if you all could recruit local volunteers for the mobile vans, right, that you have.
Oh yeah. Yeah, that's an idea we haven't explored yet. But yeah, thank you for mentioning that. The Mobile Memory Lab initially was run by mostly by digitization and special collections staff, with a couple of volunteers from other departments. Um, and it's um, uh, Over time, we saw that it would be better served if the people running the mobile, like doing the collecting, were more embedded in the communities where they were collecting from. So we, uh, when we heard the news that our library was creating these mobile outreach units, these vans, and having librarians and staff travel to different branches of different regions. We thought, that would be a perfect home for the Mobile Memory Lab, like collection, like process. We would still take care of, the description, the preservation, and access, provide the initial training. Yeah, and the outreach librarians agreed to take it on, which we're really happy about. And we're hoping to do that training maybe the end of the year for them, or early next year.
Yeah. Can you give us a sense of how many branches are planning to do or have like a mobile component?
Um, it would, I mean, we're giving over the equipment that we got from the ideas grant. It was for one. So um, we were going to give it. It was the one to be given to the mobile outreach librarians, and it would rotate
I see.
among the regions.
Got it. Okay,
Yeah.
great. So, and then
Yeah.
you would still do the training. So yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And actually, during the pandemic, the outreach librarians, they obtained a grant for something called memory cafes, where they were going to go out and collect oral history. So they have equipment additionally to that they could use
Oh, that's
for
great.
like mobile collecting activities.
That's great. Cool. Yeah, I think lots of people here are probably curious about the mobile setup too. So yeah, any suggestions around the training? But it sounds like it's all going to just continue to be centralized. So that makes sense.
Yeah.
Yeah. Olivia has a question. Did you experience any hesitancy from staff when you began training for the memory lab?
Yes, I did, for sure. It is a little bit intimidating, and especially for us with the number of formats we have. So that's why in my last presentation in February, I talked about, it would be great to start off with just a few formats, like, your first year or so, and kind of work in the other ones later on.
Yeah.
But yeah, people, I believe that if we had started with just the scanning station and VHS, that that people would not have been as scared to take it on. But we, when in the initial recruitment, I had a lot of people who are interested. Like, people are really interested in preserving like their heritage and helping other people do that. Like that in itself is a motivator. It's just in the technology part that scares some people. But it's, if you create an environment where people understand that it's okay if you don't know something, and that you can rely on other people, like your supports, and to just keep practicing, people will pick it up.
When you start with your training, do you limit it to just two kinds of formats? Do you just do like the flatbed scanning and then VHS, maybe audio cassettes? Or how do you handle the intimidation factor?
I Yeah, I break it down into a few different sessions.
Mhm.
So yeah, so it's not too many all at once.
Mhm. Great. Mhm. Any other questions out there? I know people are going to be relying on your documentation. I'm so excited. You have so much information. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Any other questions? When it comes to staff who are maintaining the equipment, can you give us a sense of like how many people are behind the scenes for you all? Is it more like just 1 to 2 people, as you suggested? Is that what's happening at LAPL?
No, actually we have Octavia Lab staff are involved in maintaining too, and we still have like volunteers
Okay.
who do come consistently. Um, so I would say when we hold our deck cleaning sessions, I consider that like our maintenance, part of our maintenance. We have like a good like 7 to 8 people
That's
coming in to work on that.
that's amazing. That's clever to weave it into a workshop, like a training session for everybody.
Mhm.
I,
Yeah,
I love the idea of this being like a skill share for everybody. Like anyone off the street can learn how to clean a deck.
yeah,
More hands on deck. Yeah, it's great. Any other
yeah.
questions or? I'm sorry, what were you going to say, Suzanne?
Oh, and I was gonna say to like for the deck cleaning sessions, like if you have something brief, like a brief sort of learning moment that you can share, you can incorporate that into those maintenance or cleaning sessions too.
Mhm.
Like uh, replacing a VHS container. That was a really quick thing that that you can include as part of that activity, and people can kind of have fun doing it themselves.
That's great. Okay, are there any more questions? I don't want to just cut us off. We're at almost at 11, but we can go later to 11:30 if there are more questions or comments. And I'll send links out, of course, of all the resources that Suzanne referred to. And I did want to put a link, a couple links for our next webinar. Here, I'll put it in the chat. It would be wonderful to see you all again. Linda Stewart is our friend coming next month from PLS or PLP. And I think she's a project advisor for some of you here, some of the CopyCat grantees. And then in August, Todd and Eddie from Tehama Public Library are coming. So I guess they were the second cohort of the Memory Lab network. Yeah, so we'll learn from their experience as we're learning from Suzanne, which is wonderful. I guess we'll get out of school early. Thank you so much, Suzanne, for your time and for all of your advice, your sage wisdom and experience. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah, I'm happy to. Thank you for having me. And yeah, you can reach out to me. My email's on the slide if you have any questions.
Great, thank you. And thank you everyone for coming. Happy Friday, happy summer.
Yes.
Yes. Okay, so until next month, goodbye everybody.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.